My son, wearing a suit that cost more than my first car, pointed a finger across the walnut table and snarled, "You are a loser. Mum's new husband isn't." The entire dinner party froze. I simply placed my silver fork down, dabbed my mouth with a napkin, and said nothing. None of them knew his cruelty had just triggered a plan I had been refining for 6 months. A plan to strip away his golden facade layer by layer. My name is Eleanor Hart. I am 62 years old, and tonight I sat like a ghost at my own son's dining table. We were in Westbridge, Colorado, in a mansion that felt more like a showroom than a home, surrounded by walls of glass that looked out over a manicured darkness. I was living here temporarily in what my son called the guest suite, though the hospitality felt as thin as the air at this altitude. The dinner was an elaborate affair. The long table was carved from black walnut, stretching out under the golden glow of a chandelier that likely cost more than the house I grew up in. Crystal glasses filled with vintage French wine caught the light, casting blood-red shadows on the white tablecloth. My son, Ethan, and his wife, Madison, sat at the center of it all, holding court with a group of their friends. They were developers, corporate lawyers, and investors, people who wore their wealth like armor. They laughed loudly, their voices booming with the confidence of those who have never had to count coupons in a grocery store line. My husband, Raymond Cole, sat beside me at the very end of the table. Ray is 65, a man with silver hair and hands calloused from a lifetime of honest labor. In his simple button-down shirt, he looked out of place among the silk ties and designer dresses. We were treated not as parents, but as obligations. Throughout the meal, whenever Ray tried to speak, to offer a pleasantry or a comment on the food, he was cut off. The conversation flowed around us like a river around stones, focused entirely on capital gains, commercial real estate acquisitions, and the volatility of the market. We were invisible until they needed someone to mock. One of the guests, a man with a heavy gold watch and a face flushed from wine, leaned back in his chair and pointed his glass toward my husband. "So, Ray, what do you do? Or are you just retired and living off Mom?" The table went quiet. It was not a respectful silence, but the stillness of a crowd waiting for a show. I felt Ray stiffen beside me, but he kept his expression neutral. Before he could answer, Madison chimed in. She offered a thin, razor-sharp smile that did not reach her eyes. "Mom always did love a dreamer. I only believe in real winners." That was the spark Ethan needed. He had been drinking steadily since the appetizers, and the arrogance in the room had inflated his ego to the bursting point. He slammed his wine glass down, just hard enough to make the crystal ring, and looked directly at me. His eyes were cold, devoid of the boy I had raised. "Mom, you are a loser. Mum's new husband isn't. At least he knows how to lose quietly." The sentence hung in the air, absolute and suffocating. My hands began to tremble beneath the table, a physical betrayal of the shock rattling through my nervous system. I forced them to stop by gripping the napkin in my lap. I carefully placed my silver fork down next to my plate. My mouth had gone completely dry, as if I had swallowed dust. The rich smell of garlic butter and seared steak, which had been appetizing moments ago, now made my stomach churn with nausea. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that seemed loud enough to drown out the polite clinking of silverware. No one spoke. The guests studied their plates or found sudden interest in the floral arrangements. Not a single person at that table. People who prided themselves on their sophistication had the decency to defend a mother being humiliated by her son. Even Raymond stayed silent, though I felt his hand slide onto my knee under the table. He gave it a gentle, firm squeeze, a gesture of helpless apology. He knew that speaking up would only give Ethan more ammunition. I did not cry. I did not shout. I reached for my water glass, my movements slow and deliberate, and took a small sip. The water felt cool against my parched throat. Inside, a thought crystallized, sharp and unbreakable. Very well. Ethan. This will be the last time you call me a loser in front of anyone. I stared down at the table, focusing on my own reflection distorted in the bowl of a polished silver spoon. The woman staring back looked grey and tired, harmless and defeated. Good. That was exactly what they needed to see. I would let them keep their victory for tonight. I would remain silent, holding onto my humiliation like a weapon, waiting for the perfect moment to let it all go. The laughter at the table didn't stop, but in my mind, the sound warped, stretching and deepening until it sounded like the hum of industrial machinery. I was no longer sitting in a climate-controlled mansion in Westbridge. I was back in Milford, in the humid, lint-filled air of bright, hollow textiles. It was the 1980s, and I was working the graveyard shift, stitching collars onto shirts I would never be able to afford, just to keep the lights on for the little boy sleeping in a rented room 3 miles away. I had left my first husband with nothing but a suitcase and a terrifying desperation. He had been a man who used his fists to solve problems. But I had made sure every single bruise ended up on my skin, never on Ethan's. I was the shield, and when the shield began to crack, I left to save the boy. I remembered being 26 years old, my eyes burning from lack of sleep. Ethan had come down with a fever that would not break. I sat by his bedside in our drafty apartment, dipping a washcloth into a bowl of cool water, wringing it out, and placing it on his forehead. Every time he whimpered, my heart fractured a little more. I whispered into the dark, "You will never lack for anything, baby. I promise." That promise cost me everything I had to give. I remembered the afternoon at Northwind Solutions. I was finally up for a promotion, a supervisor role that would have meant a salary increase of $2 an hour. It felt like a fortune. But then the school called. Ethan was having an asthma attack. The manager looked at his watch and told me if I left early again, the promotion was off the table. I did not hesitate. I looked him in the eye and said, then I quit. I ran to my car, my hands shaking, not because I had lost the job, but because I was terrified I wouldn't get to the school nurse in time. There was a night in deep winter when my car died on the side of the highway. I had to get to my shift at the Red Rail Diner, because if I missed it, we would not have rent money for the month. I walked 3 miles in the snow. The wind cut through my coat like a knife, freezing the tears on my cheeks. But I kept putting one foot in front of the other. When I finally got home that morning, my feet were so numb I could not feel them. But I was smiling because the cook had given me a stack of leftover pancakes. Ethan was wrapped in a blanket on the couch, wearing a coat because we kept the heat low to save money. He ate the cold pancakes like they were a feast. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and serious, and said, "When I grow up, I'll buy you a big house. Mom, you'll never work again." I held that sentence in my chest for 30 years. It was the fuel that kept me going when I sold my diamond engagement ring, the only valuable thing I owned, to pay for his STEM summer camp. I knew he was brilliant. I knew he needed to escape the poverty that was trying to swallow us whole. When he graduated from high school and won a full scholarship to that prestigious business university, I sat in the very last row of the bleachers. I was wearing a navy dress I had bought at a discount store. But to me, it felt like royal robes. When Ethan stood at the podium and thanked his single mom for her sacrifice, I wept. After the ceremony, he hugged me, his gown smelling of fresh starch and future success. He whispered in my ear, "Mom, I'll take care of you one day. You'll never worry about money again." The memory faded, and the cold air of the Westbridge mansion rushed back in. I looked around at the vaulted ceilings and the expensive art. Ethan had kept his promise. He had bought the big house. I was not worrying about money because I had none left to worry about. But as I sat there, listening to the clinking of silverware, I realized this house was not a sanctuary. It was a gilded cage. Being called a loser did not hurt because it was an insult. It hurt because it was a lie that erased history. It erased the freezing walks, the double shifts, and the sold jewelry. I was not a loser. For 3 decades, I had been the only winner who mattered because I had beaten the odds to get him here. And now, he was using the very success I had built for him to tear me down, to the outside world. Specifically the guests who attended Madison's meticulously curated dinner parties. Raymond and I were staying in the guest suite. It sounded elegant. In reality, we were living in a windowless room in the basement that had been partitioned off from the laundry area. It was cold, damp, and smelled perpetually of fabric softener and unvented dryer lint. Whenever Madison gave the grand tour, she would wave a manicured hand toward the basement door and say brightly, "And that is where Mom and Ray are staying. It is just temporary, of course, until they get settled." But temporary had stretched into 6 months, and getting settled seemed to be a moving target that receded further every day. The house operated under a set of invisible laws that Madison enforced with a terrifying, passive-aggressive cheerfulness. Rule number 1 was the curfew. We were not to be seen in the living room after 7 o'clock in the evening because that was family time for them to unwind and watch television. Rule number 2 involved the kitchen. I once tried to fry fish, a recipe my mother had taught me, and Madison had come home, wrinkled her nose, and spent 3 hours lighting scented candles. Now, we were forbidden from cooking anything heavy. Rule number 3 was the isolation. I had suggested inviting a few ladies from my old book club over for tea, but Madison had sighed, looking pained. "Oh, Eleanor, I would love that, really. But the parking is so limited in the driveway, and I hate to clutter the street." I tried to make myself useful. Every morning, I woke up at 5 o'clock to brew coffee and wipe down the counters. Yet, without fail, Madison would come down, pour the coffee I made down the sink, and start a fresh pot. She would take the rag from my hand with a tight, plastic smile. "It is okay. Mum, I have got it. You go rest." It was a brilliant tactic. She managed to make me feel useless and burdensome in the same breath. The most humiliating shift, however, was the money. Shortly after we moved in, Ethan sat me down and explained that for security reasons, my pension and Social Security should be deposited into a joint account he managed. He claimed it was to protect me from scams. Now, I had to ask him for cash like a teenager. Every Monday, he handed me a crisp $50 bill. "For your little expenses," he would say. I watched my financial autonomy evaporate, replaced by an allowance that barely covered toiletries. One Sunday brunch. Madison had her friends over. They were drinking mimosas on the patio, and the glass doors were open. I was in the kitchen, invisible as always. I heard Madison's voice drift in. We are basically supporting 2 more adults right now. It is a lot, you know, but we are just too kind to say no. I froze, the sponge in my hand dripping soapy water onto the floor. She knew I could hear her. She simply did not care. Raymond took it even harder. My husband had been a proud man, a skilled independent contractor with his own company, Harbour Line Maintenance, for 40 years. He could fix anything from a leaking roof to a broken circuit board. Now, Ethan treated him like a dim-witted servant. Last week, the garbage disposal jammed. Ethan called down to the basement. Hey, Ray, can you take a look at this? Ray fixed it in 10 minutes, his hands moving with the practiced grace of a master. When he finished, wiping grease from his knuckles, Ethan slapped him on the back. Thanks, man. I cannot pay you. But, well, you live here for free already. Right? Ray didn't say a word. He just lowered his head and walked back to the basement. The cruelty was not always verbal. Sometimes it was digital. On a Tuesday afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from Madison. I opened it to see a single line. I can't stand the smell of old people in my house. My breath hitched. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering. 3 minutes later, a follow-up text appeared. OMG. So sorry. Mom, that was autocorrect. I meant to say old purple, talking about some drapes, love you. I knew there were no purple drapes in the house, but the final blow, the one that truly clarified my position, happened yesterday. I was coming up the stairs and heard voices in the study. Ethan and Madison were discussing Silver Crest Haven, a state-funded nursing facility on the edge of town known for its overcrowding. It is perfectly adequate, Ethan was saying, his voice devoid of emotion. Medicare covers the majority of the cost. If we move them there by next quarter, we will save thousands a month on groceries and utilities. And we get the basement back. Madison added. I backed down the stairs, my heart pounding. Living in this house was like walking on a plush, white carpet that hid thousands of upright needles. It looked soft, but every step drew blood. I had learned to walk softly, to close doors without a sound, to exist in the negative spaces of their lives. That night, lying in the dark basement, I pulled up a photo on my phone. It was a scanned picture of Ethan and me from 30 years ago. He was 5, missing a front tooth, clinging to my leg like I was the only solid thing in the universe. I stroked the small, pixelated face with my thumb. When did I become surplus in your life? I whispered to the silence. When did I stop being your mother and start being an expense to understand how much I lost? I have to remember what I had found. My mind drifted back 2 years, away from the cold basement and into the warm, dusty light of my old life. I had just taken early retirement from Lumen Care Family Services. My back had finally given out after decades of sitting in cheap office chairs, and the emotional toll of social work had left me hollow. I was living alone in a rented apartment in Bluewood, a neighborhood where the paint was peeling but the neighbors still waved hello. I met Raymond at the local YMCA. We were both in a rehabilitation class for seniors. I was there for my lumbar spine. He was rehabilitating a left knee that had been crushed in a construction accident. He was the only one who spoke to me. He sat down on the mat next to mine, wiped sweat from his forehead with a towel, and smiled. They say motion is lotion, he joked, pointing to his stiff leg. But right now, It feels more like sandpaper. We started grabbing coffee after class at the Corner Cup Cafe. We sat in the booth by the window for hours, nursing lukewarm mugs and sharing the specific, quiet grief of parents whose children have grown up and moved on. We talked about the silence in our homes, the medical bills that piled up on the counter like snowdrifts, and the insomnia caused by the hum of an old refrigerator. Raymond was open about his life. He told me about Harbour Line Maintenance, the small repair company he had built from nothing. He told me how his business partner had embezzled everything and vanished, leaving Ray to face the bankruptcy courts alone. He was paying off the debts slowly, living a monastic life. "I am the only guy I know who is an unemployed workaholic," he would say with a chuckle. "Too old to get hired, too broke to retire." I was terrified to let him in. I worried constantly about what Ethan would think. I worried I was too old for romance. But Raymond was patient. One afternoon, while I was fretting about whether I should buy a new winter coat or save the money, he looked at me over his coffee cup. "Elle," he said softly, "when was the last time anyone asked you what you need?" I did not have an answer. A week later, he came over to fix a wobbly dining table in my apartment. It had been annoying me for months. He spent 20 minutes underneath it, tightening screws and adjusting the legs until it was rock solid. When I tried to pay him, he shook his head and packed his tools. "Keep your money," he said, looking me in the eye. "Just consider it. A reason for me to come back and check on it." We got married 6 months later at the Westbridge City Hall. It was a Tuesday. Our witnesses were 2 of my neighbours. Ethan was not there. When I called to invite him, he told me he was closing a $1 million deal and could not possibly fly out for some ridiculous wedding. It did not matter. For a brief, beautiful time, we were happy. We squeezed into my small apartment. We cooked spaghetti with cheap sauce, laughing when we bumped hips in the narrow kitchen. We spent evenings trying to figure out how to use Netflix, arguing over the remote before eventually settling for rewatching old VHS tapes of westerns. We were poor, but we were peaceful. Then came the fall. I slipped in the bathroom one wet morning and fractured my hip. I ended up in the hospital, frightened and vulnerable. That was when Ethan appeared. He swept in like a savior, wearing a cashmere coat and an expression of deep concern. He looked at the hospital room, then at Raymond, and shook his head. "This place is depressing," Ethan said. "And your apartment is a death trap with those stairs. Mum, Ray. Why don't you move into the villa? We have the space. I can keep an eye on you. It will be safer." It sounded like a dream, a family reunion, a chance to be close to my son again. I remember sitting at the kitchen table in my Bluewood apartment a month later, signing the papers to sell the place. Ethan had explained that the proceeds would go into renovating the guest suite to make it accessible for us. I handed over the check from the sale, and I handed over my savings, believing I was investing in our collective future. I thought I was signing the first page of a happy ending. I whispered to myself now, in the dark of Ethan's basement. Turns out, it was just the first step of losing everything. The atmosphere in the house shifted. It was no longer just a hostile environment. It became a crime scene where the evidence was being slowly, methodically erased. It started on a Thursday afternoon. I was dusting the hallway, invisible as usual, when Ethan walked past with his phone pressed to his ear. He did not lower his voice, because you do not lower your voice for the furniture. "Yes, exactly." He was saying, We need to transition the assets into an irrevocable trust. It makes management easier, and it protects the capital from, well, from poor decision-making. I did not understand all the legal terminology, but the phrase irrevocable trust made the hair on my arms stand up. 2 days later, Madison cornered me in the kitchen. She was holding a stack of documents thick enough to be a novel. She was moving fast, vibrating with that frantic energy she used to bulldoze over objections. "Mom, sorry to rush you, but I need you to sign these insurance updates," she said, uncapping a pen and shoving it into my hand. "The broker is closing in an hour. It is just standard stuff to make sure you are covered under our policy." I tried to read the top page. The text was microscopic. A wall of legalese. "Madison, I should probably read, 'Oh, Mom, please.'" She interrupted, tapping her manicured fingernail against the signature line. "It is just liability jargon. You can trust me, right? Just sign here, and here, and one more on the back." I signed. I signed because I was tired, because I wanted her to stop tapping the paper, and because part of me still wanted to believe they were helping. The wake-up call came from Raymond. A week later, he was in Ethan's home office to fix a stuck drawer in the filing cabinet. When he came back down to our basement room, his face was pale. He pulled his phone from his pocket and showed me a photo he had taken secretly. It was a letter from Frontier Ridge Bank, addressed to me, but opened and hidden in Ethan's file. "L," Raymond whispered, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "Look at the date. We waited until 3 o'clock in the morning. Using my old laptop, we logged into the online banking portal for the account where I had deposited the money from selling my apartment. My hands shook as I typed the password. The screen loaded. Balance $0 and 0 cents. We clicked on the transaction history. A transfer of $215,000, every penny I had left in the world, had been moved 3 weeks ago into an account labeled the Hart Family Trust. The signatory was Ethan Hart. The next morning, I found Ethan in the kitchen making an espresso. I kept my voice steady, masking the thunder in my chest. "Ethan." I was looking at my account online. The money from the apartment sale seems to be missing. He did not even turn around. He took a sip of his coffee, then leaned against the counter, looking at me with the pity one reserves for a confused child. "It is not missing. Mom, I moved it," he said casually. "I am protecting you from yourself. You are getting older. You are not sharp enough to manage that kind of capital anymore. In the trust, it is safe? Even from you." "Safe?" I asked. Madison walked in then, her gym bag over her shoulder. She didn't miss a beat. "It is for the best. Eleanor, once the assets are fully secured, we can look at moving you and Ray to Silvercrest Haven. They have professional medical staff. This house is lovely, but it is not a nursing home. And frankly, we are not equipped to deal with, well, decline." They walked out, leaving me standing there. Raymond, who had been listening from the hallway, walked in. His jaw was set like stone. "They are not worried about your health. L. Silvercrest Haven is a warehouse for the indigent. Ethan is moving your money so it does not get eaten up by care costs. He is hiding your assets to qualify you for state aid, so he keeps the inheritance. It is tax optimization, not care." For the first time since this nightmare began, I did not cry. I felt a coldness settle in my chest, a freezing calm that was sharper and clearer than grief. It was the feeling of a surgeon scrubbing in before an amputation. "Okay," I said. The word sounded like a gavel striking wood. From that hour on, I became a spy in my own life. I started checking the trash cans. I uncrumpled receipts. I took screenshots of every email Ethan left open on the family iPad. Raymond, who struggled to program a microwave, sat with me for hours as we learned how to scan documents and save them onto a thumb drive the size of a stick of gum. We hid the drive inside the hollow curtain rod in the basement. I looked at the growing pile of digital evidence and thought about the dinner party. Ethan thought he was playing a game of chess against a senile opponent. If there is a loser in this story, I thought as I saved another incriminating PDF, it is the man who thinks he is the smartest person at the table, never imagining that the person quietly taking notes is his own mother. I remembered a woman named Janet Rhodes. We had worked together years ago when I was at Lumencare. She had moved on to the Westbridge Community Legal Centre, a place that smelled of stale coffee and desperation, but where the people actually cared. I sent her a text message from the bathroom, my fingers trembling over the keys. Need to ask about seniors and money. Urgent. We met 2 days later in her cramped office. The blinds were bent, and files were stacked in towers on her desk. Janet listened to me for 20 minutes without interrupting. As I spoke, her expression shifted from polite interest to a dark, simmering fury. When I finished explaining about the insurance papers and the lost bank transfers, she slammed her hand down on her desk. "Eleanor, this is not financial management," she said, her voice hard. "This is financial abuse of the elderly. It is textbook. They are isolating you, controlling your access to funds, and using undue influence to get signatures." She pulled the copies of the documents I had scanned on the USB drive toward her. Her eyes scanned the fine print of the papers Madison had rushed me to sign. "See this clause?" Janet pointed with a pen. "This was not just insurance liability. You effectively waived your right to contest certain transfers. But because they misrepresented the document to you, we can argue it is void. However, we need to stop the bleeding immediately." That afternoon, Raymond and I walked into the Prairie Stone Credit Union. It was a small branch with worn carpet, a world away from the marble-floored bank Ethan used. We opened a new, private account. We redirected Raymond's small pension and my Social Security checks to deposit directly here. It was not a fortune, maybe $2,000 a month between us. But it was ours. It was the first time in 6 months I had money that Ethan could not see. Janet then introduced us to Mr. Gomez, an independent financial advisor who worked pro bono for the centre. He was a quiet man with thick glasses who looked at numbers the way a mechanic looks at an engine. He reviewed the trust documents I had photographed. "Your son has set himself up as the sole trustee with almost unlimited power," Gomez explained, tapping the screen. "He has a fiduciary duty to act in your best interest. But the way this is written, he can argue that locking your money away for future care is in your interest, even while he uses the principal as collateral for his own loans." So I gave him the knife to cut my throat. I said softly, "We are going to take the knife back," Janet said. She slid a new document across the desk. It was a durable power of attorney. "Right now, if you are declared incompetent, Ethan makes every decision for you. Sign this, and we revoke his authority. If anyone needs to make decisions for you, it will be Raymond." I picked up the pen. The ink looked blacker than usual. Signing that paper felt like severing the umbilical cord, a final admission that my son was no longer my family, but my adversary. I signed my name clearly. Eleanor Hart. That night, back in the basement. Raymond and I taped a large piece of paper to the back of the wardrobe where Madison would never look. It was our war map. We drew a timeline. Tuesday, meet Janet. Wednesday, secure independent funds. Friday, appointment with Dr. Evans for a competency evaluation. That was the shield we needed. Ethan's entire narrative relied on the lie that I was a confused, senile old woman who needed his protection. A clean bill of mental health from a respected geriatric psychiatrist would shatter that lie in court. We stay quiet, Raymond whispered, tracing the timeline with his finger. The single bulb overhead cast long shadows across his face. We let them think they have won. We let them think we are just two helpless old people living in their basement. Let them get comfortable. Let them sign something too big because they think no one is watching. Then, we flipped the table. I looked at him, and then I looked at the ceiling, knowing my son and his wife were sleeping comfortably above us. For months, I had been paralyzed by heartbreak, mourning the little boy who used to promise to take care of me. But as I stared at the timeline, the grief evaporated. I do not want him to love me anymore, I told Raymond, my voice steady in the damp air. I just want him to be unable to destroy what is left of my life. I will deal with the emotions later. The legal battle starts today. Janet advised me to stay put. If you pack your bags and leave now, he will panic and lock everything down. She had warned me. Stay. Be the doting mother. Let him get comfortable. So, I stayed. I became a ghost in the hallways of the Westbridge mansion, but a ghost with a digital recorder tucked into my apron pocket. I only recorded conversations in the common areas, strictly between Ethan and Madison, capturing the truth they whispered when they thought I was napping. One evening, while I was folding laundry in the hallway, I caught Madison complaining about the grocery budget. I am sick of buying soft foods for them, she hissed. It is like feeding two overgrown toddlers. They are such a financial burden. Just hang on, Ethan's voice replied, cold and detached. Once the trust is finalized, the cash flow issues disappear. We just need to keep them happy for another month. I saved that file carefully. To accelerate his carelessness, I invited Ethan to lunch at La Vigne, the most expensive French restaurant in town. I wore my oldest cardigan, hunching my shoulders to look smaller, frailer, over plates of escargot that cost $20 a dozen. I reached across the table and patted his hand. Ethan, I said, letting my voice wobble just enough. I am just so tired of worrying about details. I trust you. I will sign whatever you need me to sign. I just want to rest. He beamed. It was a predator's smile. That is the right decision. Mum? You just relax. I will handle the heavy lifting. He was so emboldened by my surrender that he became sloppy. That very afternoon, he left his laptop open on the kitchen island while he took a call on the terrace. I walked over, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm of rage. On the screen was a draft email to his lawyer. The subject line was asset consolidation. I read the text. Once everything is under my control, we can look into long-term care facility options for my mum and her husband. We need something cost-effective. The basement needs to be cleared out by summer. I took a picture. He wasn't planning for our care. He was planning our eviction. Meanwhile, Raymond was executing his part of the strategy. Following Janet's advice, he took a job repairing a deck for our neighbors down the street. He insisted on a formal contract and a check, creating a paper trail. It proved he was capable, employed, and generating income, disproving Ethan's narrative that we were helpless dependents who needed a guardian. The final piece of armor came from Dr. Evans, a geriatric psychiatrist. I spent 3 hours in his office undergoing a battery of cognitive tests. I memorized lists, solved logic puzzles, and navigated complex mazes on paper. At the end, he handed me a sealed report. "Mrs. Hart," he said, handing me the envelope. "You are as sharp as a tack. Anyone suggesting otherwise is either lying or blind. This report confirms you are fully competent to make your own financial decisions." I held that envelope like a loaded gun, oblivious to the trap closing around him. Ethan was busy building his own stage. He began bragging to his friends about his new family office and how he was responsibly managing the wealth I had spent 40 years earning. To cap off this triumph, Madison began organizing a massive dinner party. "It is the launch of the Hart Family Foundation," Madison chirped one morning, holding up a sample invitation printed on heavy cream cardstock. "We are inviting the bank partners, the investors, even my parents. Ethan is going to make a speech about family legacy." "That sounds wonderful," I said, pouring my own coffee. I realized then that they had handed me the perfect venue. Ethan wanted an audience, I would give him one. All the people he needed to impress the bankers, the socialites, the people whose validation fueled his ego would be in one room. If I exposed him privately, he would spin the story. If I exposed him there, in front of the people who held the keys to his future, the damage would be irreversible. I went downstairs to the basement and texted Janet and Mr. Gomez, "Tuesday night, 7 o'clock. Come to the front door." Then I made one more call. I arranged for a surprise guest, someone whose presence would shatter the last remnant of Ethan's composure. I packed the USB drive into my purse. "Are you ready?" Raymond asked me that night, watching me brush my hair in the cracked mirror of the basement bathroom. "I am not doing this for revenge," I told him, staring at my reflection. "I am doing this for every mother who ever starved so her child could feast, only to be eaten by that child in the end." I put down the brush. "Yes, I am ready." The dining room of the villa had been transformed into a theatre of wealth. The overhead chandelier, polished to a blinding brilliance, cast a diamond-hard light over arrangements of white lilies and orchids that smelled sickeningly sweet. At every place setting, a heavy card embossed with gold script read Hart Family Foundation Launch Dinner. It was a production, and we were merely props. The table was surrounded by the people Ethan desperately needed to impress. There were his business partners, a few local journalists scribbling in notebooks, and, most importantly, the senior loan officer from Frontier Ridge Bank. This was the man holding the keys to the credit line extension Ethan had been sweating over for weeks. Raymond and I were seated at the very far end of the table, near the kitchen door, practically in a different time zone from where Ethan held court at the head, before the appetizers arrived. Madison had leaned in, her breath smelling of mints and aggression. "Mom, just sit there," she had whispered, her smile tight. "Do not say a word. We will handle everything. Just nod if someone looks at you." I folded my hands in my lap and waited. Halfway through the main course, Ethan stood up. He tapped a silver spoon against his crystal champagne flute, the sharp ring, ring, ring silencing the room. He adjusted his silk tie and looked out at the guests with misty, practiced eyes. "When I was a boy, Ethan began, his voice dropping an octave to signal deep emotion. My mother worked double shifts just to put food on the table. She was a hero, but he paused for effect, looking down at me with a pitying smile. But she never understood money. She came from a simple world, a world of survival. She worked hard, but she did not know how to build. That is why I have established this foundation, to protect the legacy she could not manage herself, to make sure that in her twilight years, she never has to worry about the complexities of finance that overwhelm her. I listened to my life being rewritten. He took the freezing walks, the skipped meals, the strategic sale of my jewelry acts of supreme calculation and survival, and twisted them into evidence of incompetence. He was painting a portrait of a woman who was too simple to function, a woman who needed her brilliant son to take the reins. Under the table. I gripped Raymond's hand so hard my knuckles turned white. He squeezed back, his thumb rubbing over my skin. An anchor in the storm. I did not blink. I did not frown. I let the insults land. The representative from Frontier Ridge Bank nodded solemnly, raising his glass. To Ethan, he announced. It is rare to see a man so dedicated to the previous generation. You are a model of responsibility. The room erupted in polite applause. Soft jazz music began to swell from the hidden speakers, signaling the end of the speech. Ethan looked radiant, basking in the glow of his own lie. Then, the doorbell rang. It was a sharp, jarring sound that cut through the music. Madison frowned, checking her diamond watch. "Who on earth is that?" she muttered to the woman beside her. "We did not invite anyone else." She signaled to the hired server, but the front door was already opening. The murmur of the party died down as 3 figures stepped into the entryway, bringing with them a draught of cold night air. Janet Rhodes stood in front, clutching a leather briefcase. Beside her was Mr. Gomez, adjusting his glasses, and flanking them was a stern-faced woman in a navy blazer, the representative from the county's Adult Protective Services. They did not look like party guests. They looked like a reckoning. The air in the room grew heavy. The clinking of silverware stopped. Ethan's smile faltered, twitching at the corners as he tried to maintain the facade. "Ah," Ethan stammered, standing up but looking unsure. It seems some of our family advisors have arrived late. Please, everyone, continue eating." He glared at them, his eyes screaming, "Get out!" But they did not move. I pushed my chair back. The legs scraped against the hardwood floor, a harsh sound that made several guests jump. For the first time all evening, for the first time in 6 months, I did not look down. I stood up. I smoothed the front of my dress and began to walk. It was a long walk from the children's end of the table to the head, but I took my time. I felt every eye in the room fixed on me, the bankers, the journalists, my son. I reached the head of the table and stopped directly behind Ethan's chair. I placed one hand on the back of his seat, feeling the tension radiating off his shoulders. I looked at the stunned guests, then at the bank representative, and finally, I looked down at my son. "Ethan," I said, my voice clear and steady, cutting through the silence like a blade. "I would like to say a few words. As the woman you have been talking about all evening, I think it is only fair." I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of expensive lilies and impending ruin. I looked straight into his eyes, seeing the sudden flicker of terror behind the arrogance. He knew. In that split second, he knew the script had changed. I smiled, not with warmth, but with the cold precision of a trap snapping shut. I was ready to burn his stage to the ground. "Thank you, Ethan," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like ice water. "For telling your version of the story. It was illuminating." I turned my gaze to the table, sweeping over the faces of the bankers and investors who were frozen with their forks halfway to their mouths. "Tell me, Bass, anyone here ever signed a financial document they did not fully understand simply because they trusted the person handing them the pen?" A few uncomfortable shifts in chairs followed. Ethan tried to step in, his smile wavering. "Mum, this is hardly the place." "It is exactly the place," I interrupted, my voice sharpening. "Because this is where you built the lie." Janet Rhodes stepped forward, opening her briefcase. She laid out a series of papers on the white tablecloth, right next to the crystal wine glasses. "These are documents Mrs. Hart was told were routine insurance updates," Janet explained to the room, her voice projecting with courtroom authority. In reality, they were waivers, transferring control of her pension and savings into a joint account. She was never given the chance to read them. She was told to trust her son. "She is confused," Ethan said quickly, a sheen of sweat appearing on his forehead. He looked at the bank representative, laughing nervously. "Mum gets mixed up. She forgets details. I have to manage it for her because she is not capable." "Is that so?" Janet pulled a sealed envelope from her file. "This is a cognitive evaluation performed 3 days ago by Dr. Evans, the leading geriatric specialist in the state. It certifies that Eleanor Hart is fully competent, sharp, and capable of managing her own affairs. The argument that she needs a guardian is a fabrication." Ethan's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Mr. Gomez stepped up next. He did not look at Ethan. He looked at the bank representative. "We have traced the assets," Gomez said, his tone dry and professional. "Mr. Hart has moved nearly $215,000 of his mother's money into a trust where he is the sole beneficiary. And we found this." He held up a printout of an email. An email from Mr. Hart to his lawyer. Quote, "Once everything is under my control, we can look into long-term care facility options. The basement needs to be cleared out by summer." End quote. A gasp rippled through the room. The representative from Adult Protective Services spoke up, her voice grim. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you are describing is the textbook definition of financial elder abuse. In this state, it is not just a civil matter. Depending on the intent, it can be a criminal offense." Ethan let out a strangled laugh, his hands shaking as he reached for his wine glass, spilling a drop of red on the white cloth. "This is ridiculous. This is just a family misunderstanding. You know how it is. Mom is. She is getting old. She forgets things. She is making a scene because she is confused." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the original medical report. I slapped it onto the table with a sound like a gunshot. "I have not forgotten enough to sign my life away to you. Ethan Madison." Seeing their carefully constructed reality crumbling, slammed her hand on the table. Her face was flushed with anger, the veins in her neck standing out. "We gave you a roof over your head?" she shouted, forgetting her perfect hostess mask. "We gave you food. We paid the electric bill in exchange for all that. We took a little control over finances that you do not even use. We deserve that money for putting up with you." The room went dead silent. The guests looked at Madison with open horror. She had just admitted it. "Is that how you see it?" I asked softly. "A transaction." I pulled my phone from my pocket and connected it to the small Bluetooth speaker on the sideboard. "Then let us hear the terms of the deal." I pressed play. The audio was crisp and clear. Ethan's voice. "Once the trust is finalized, the cash flow issues disappear. We just need to keep them happy for another month." Madison's voice. "I am sick of buying soft foods for them. It is like feeding two overgrown toddlers. We need to find a nursing home. Something cheap. But, you know, not looking too terrible from the outside." I stopped the recording. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. It was the sound of a reputation dying. The representative from Frontier Ridge Bank slowly placed his napkin on the table. He looked at Ethan with eyes devoid of warmth. "Mr. Hart," he said, his voice flat. "I believe the bank will need to pause our review of your credit line extension. We need to re-examine the structure of any assets involving senior family members. Immediately." Ethan stood frozen. He looked around the table, desperate for an ally, for someone to laugh it off with him. But the investors were checking their phones. The journalists were writing furiously. The partners were looking at the floor. The man who had spent years crafting an image of the perfect, successful son was now standing in the wreckage of his own greed, exposed as nothing more than a predator feeding on his own mother. "You?" Ethan whispered, staring at me, his face turning a blotchy red. "Me?" I answered. "The loser." Ethan slammed his flat palm against the table, the force of the blow making the wine glasses jump. His face was a mask of twisted red fury, the polished executive facade finally cracking wide open. "Mum, you are destroying everything because of some loser husband you just met," he shouted, spitting the words across the centerpiece. "You have no idea how much I have done for you. You are ungrateful." The insult hung in the air, an echo of the dinner that had started this war. But this time, it sounded desperate rather than arrogant. I responded for the first time directly to his anger, my voice slow and deliberate. "You call him a loser. At least he does not use the signature of another person to become wealthy. At least he has never calculated the price of a single pill for the person he calls his mother." I reached into my purse and pulled out the final document. It was the one Janet and I had finalized only yesterday. "I have officially transferred all remaining fiduciary power to Raymond," I announced to the silent room. "I have updated my will. You are removed from every decision regarding my assets. I did this to protect myself, Ethan, but also to protect you from the crime you seem so eager to commit." Janet stepped forward and slid a stiff piece of paper toward Ethan. It was a legal notice. "The court has received our petition to monitor the assets of a vulnerable senior," she said calmly. "The accounts you control are temporarily frozen pending the investigation. You cannot move a single cent?" It was a direct hit to the only thing Ethan truly loved: his control. He stared at the paper, his hands trembling. Madison, smelling the smoke of her burning lifestyle, immediately pivoted. She rushed around the table, her eyes wide with a performance of concern. She grabbed my hand, her grip clammy. "Mom, oh Mom, please. You are misunderstanding us. We only worry about you. We just want you to be safe." I looked down at her hand on my arm. It felt like a stranger's touch. I gently but firmly pulled my arm away. "You worry about your image, Madison," I said quietly. not about me. For a brief second, my eyes met Ethan's. I searched for the little boy who used to cling to my leg, the boy who promised to buy me a big house. He was not there. In his eyes, I saw only fear. Fear of poverty, fear of humiliation, fear of the truth. I realized then that the son I loved had died years ago, replaced by this man whom the system had shaped into a hollow shell. I turned to the guests, who were watching this collapse with morbid fascination. "If anyone tonight wants to know what a loser is," I said, my voice carrying to the back of the room, "it is the person who is ready to sell his own mother cheap just to look like a success in front of others." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the key to the basement suite. It was a simple silver key, unadorned and cold. I placed it gently on the linen tablecloth next to the untouched dessert fork. "I am leaving this house tonight," I stated. "Not because I am being kicked out, but because I choose to go. I no longer owe anyone at this table a meal, a bill, or a thank you." Ethan stood rooted to the spot, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. Janet and the representative from Adult Protective Services began speaking to him in low, serious tones about the next legal steps. I turned away. Raymond was waiting by the archway. He had brought the 2 small suitcases we had packed in secret 3 days ago. He looked at me and nodded, a look of profound pride in his eyes. I walked toward him, my head high. I did not look back at the basement door. I did not look back at the chandelier. We walked out into the cool night air. Raymond's old sedan was parked in the driveway, looking battered and dusty next to Ethan's gleaming luxury cars. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I climbed into the passenger seat and shut the door. The sound was solid and final. As the engine sputtered to life, the phrase echoed in my mind one last time. "You're a loser. Mum's new husband isn't." I smiled in the dark. I understood now. The only true loser was the man standing in that mansion, watching his life unravel because he had underestimated the one thing money could not buy, a mother who loved him enough to stop enabling him. We drove down the long driveway, leaving the golden cage behind. I left the past in the rearview mirror, leaving Ethan to face the future he had built for himself. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would truly love to hear where you folks are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and let's share our thoughts together. If this story moved you, please make sure to subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, hit that like button, and give the video a hype so we can get this story heard by even more people. Take care of yourselves.